focus was on public policy. Whoops. Okay, let me try again. Kathy Lee taught political science at College of the Redwoods and Cal Poly Humboldt for 25 years. Her particular focus was on public policy and environmental politics. She also leads the OLLI interest group, Issues in Public Policy, that meets monthly on Wednesdays from 3 to 4:30 online, which examines current political and policy issues, which you can join for $50 for, I believe, it's the whole year. She also conducts a Buddhist group at Pelican Prison and has an extensive vegetable garden and duck pond. I think you've got some geese too, don't you? At her home, which we visited years ago as part of Transition Humboldt. She's very, very interesting individual, and her classes and interest group are a lot of fun. Kathy, it's all yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you for that introduction. Today, we're going to talk about the risks that we face given what happens with the results of this coming election. And I'd like to start off just by reading something. So, Jane, you can go ahead and put the title slide up. People don't need to be looking at me.
You mean Judy?
Judy, sorry.
Just give me
What
one
no one
second,
seemed
really
to
quick.
notice, said a colleague of mine, was the ever-widening gap between the government and the people. You know, it doesn't make people close to their government to be told that this is a people's government, a true democracy, or to be enrolled in civil defense, or even to vote. All of this really has nothing to do with knowing one's government. What happened here was the gradual habituation of the people, little by little, to being governed by surprise, to receiving decisions deliberated in secret, to believe that the situation was so complicated that the government had to act on information which the people could not understand, or so dangerous that even if the people could understand it, it could not be released because of national security. To live this process is absolutely not to be able to notice it. Please try to believe me. Unless one has a much greater degree of political awareness, acuity, than most of us ever had the occasion to develop, each step was so small, so inconsequential, so well explained or on occasion regretted, that unless one were detached from the whole process from the beginning, unless one understood what the whole thing was in principle, what all these little measures that no patriotic person could resent must someday lead to, one no more saw it developing from day to day than a farmer in his field sees the corn growing, and one day it's over his head. That is from a book called They Thought They Were Free, Germany, 1933 to 1945, by Milton Mayer. Mayer was an American sociologist who went to a relatively small town in Germany after World War II and interviewed the inhabitants there to try to understand how they perceived the Nazi regime and the conduct of the war. And he found that it really was a gradual thing. And when we think of how authoritarianism could overrule the American Constitution and the American democracy, we tend to think of military coups. Most of the movie representations of this take that approach. But what is much more likely to happen is a kind of boring, incremental, step-by-step undermining of it. And that's what we need to explore today. Next slide. So first, I want to go through a bit of theory, and then we'll talk about practice. There are two basic theories of democracy. The first one is procedural, which basically says if you follow democratic procedures, then the final result is going to be democratic. And it has some assumptions. It assumes, if not universal participation, at least broad participation, equality, that each vote is counted equally, that 50% won carries victory in elections, and that the government follows voters' desires. Now, those are all pretty big assumptions, but the major problem with it is the majority can oppress minorities while following proper procedure. Next slide. Substantive democracy says you have to focus on democratic ends as well as democratic means. And it says that there are certain underlying principles must be incorporated to prevent the majority from abusing the minority. The problem with this is it's not as simple as procedural democracy. You have to decide which principles need to be followed, and everyone has to agree to follow those principles. So the US Constitution limits the powers of government even if the majority agrees to give the government those powers. So for example, today, you might find that a majority of Americans would like to end birthright citizenship, which means if you're born in the United States under the 14th Amendment, if you're born in the United States, you're a citizen of the United States and the state that you reside in. And they would like to change that. But the Constitution says, even if the majority wants that, they're going to have to amend the Constitution, which is very difficult to do because that is in direct violation. Next slide. What we consider democracy is actually a mixture of rule by the people and what they call constitutional liberalism. Now, liberalism here does not refer to liberal in terms of political ideology. It's more like classical liberalism, which is limits on government and protection of rights. So the components of constitutional liberalism are, first and foremost, the rule of law. And the rule of law says you follow the law when it's convenient and you follow the law when it's inconvenient. Even if it works against your own interest, if it's the law, then you need to follow it. The next component is separation of powers, that each of the three branches has a role to play, and also checks and balances, the being able to check the power of the other branch of government, and then the protection of those basic liberties of speech, assembly, religion, and property that we find in the Bill of Rights. Next slide. So this is what you all learned in your civics classes in high school, or those of you who had to take American government when you were in college, that each branch of the federal government, and we see that this is also copied at state governments, has their own jobs. The legislative branch, which the founders really considered to be the most important branch and the one that they initially gave most of the power to, would make laws. The president would carry out those laws, and the courts would interpret those laws. Each branch also has the ability to check the other, right? Congress can pass laws that restrict executive power, but the president can veto laws. It takes a supermajority to do that, but he's able to. The courts can check the power of the legislature and the executive branch by ruling laws and policies to be unconstitutional. But in order for this to work, everyone has to do their job. And there's nothing magic about this, because there are times in US history where, even though this was really quite clear, they didn't carry it out. For example, probably the most famous example so far is the Indian Removal Act being overturned by the Marshall Supreme Court during the Jackson administration, and having Congress and the president ignore that, which led to the ethnic cleansing of the Southern Indian tribes in what's called the Trail of Tears. On the other hand, you had a situation in the 1950s where the court had ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that schools had to be desegregated. Eisenhower was not in favor of desegregation. He had made that clear through his campaigns and early in his presidency. However, once the Supreme Court made that ruling and the states were refusing to follow it, he deployed the National Guard to those southern states to enforce that, because he said mob rule cannot be allowed to overrule the decisions of our court. So we see this tendency to follow the law, and that's generally been the way it is, but there's nothing magic about it. There's no Constitution man who flies down and says, stop right there, that's a violation of the Constitution. Everyone has to do their job. Next slide. Now that's the theory. Of course, I looked for a graphic on theory and practice, and this was the best one I could find. The practice is a lot messier than the theory, as is often the case. Next slide. One thing that has led to this situation we face today is an ever-expanding transfer of power from the executive branch and the judicial branch, from the congressional branch and the judicial branch to the executive branch. And generally in political science, we say that there are three ways that this has happened, and which we've recently seen an additional one. The first one is called inherent powers. If a president claims a power, not claims a power, sorry, and gets away with it, it sets a precedent. So generally, this happens a lot in emergencies. And if the president is able to establish that they have that power, such as deploying troops without a declaration of war, and then subsequent presidents can claim that as precedent. And so this is one of the ways we've seen this expand. The other is congressional delegation. If Congress passes a law that grants the president powers previously not held, that it expands the power of the executive branch. An example of this is the New Deal legislation that gave regulatory power to the federal government over business, and power to the federal government, to the executive branch, to oversee the social safety net. Another example is the Patriot Act that passed after 9/11, which granted the executive branch powers that they had not had before. The last one traditionally is called the bully pulpit. And the bully pulpit is a term that Teddy Roosevelt used to describe the executive branch and the presidency, saying when the president says something, people pay attention. And therefore, the president is able to use his power and influence to get Congress to pass the laws that he wants to see passed. Early presidents generally just carried out the laws that were passed by Congress and had not that much influence in terms of setting policy. Of course, the executive was smaller then. It was much, much less involved in people's lives, and most of actual governing was done by the states. But what we've seen in recent years is court power with this recent decision with regards to presidential immunity. But the court has not always been delegating the same. The court has tended in recent years to allow expansion of executive power under Republican administrations, but restrict that power, particularly in terms of regulating economic activity and the environment, strip that power from the executive branch under Democratic administrations. Next slide. So authoritarianism is a system of government that has highly concentrated and centralized government power. It's maintained by repressing the opposition and excluding it to that. It all mass mobilization of the population around the goals of the regime. So there's a lot of propaganda and a lot of enlistment of the population to support the government. In the United States, this is pretty unlikely, at least in the short term, just given the political culture of the United States. But it doesn't mean that it's impossible. So the next slide. What is more likely to happen is a liberal democracy. Now, the term a liberal democracy was first coined by the journalist Fareed Zakaria in the late 1990s. And in 2007, he wrote a book called The Future of Freedom, Liberal Democracy at Home and Abroad. This is sometimes called democratic backsliding because it refers to situations where you've had constitutional liberalism and democracy, And then actions are taken to scale that back. And the actions are not taken in direct violation of the Constitution, but more as a way of sort of hiding what's happening behind those democratic institutions and procedures. It involves polarization of the electorate into us and them, othering of the opposition. It involves attacking independent media, controlling the judiciary, controlling the bureaucracy, scapegoating independent institutions like universities, labor unions, civic groups. And we're seeing this today in several countries, including Hungary, Turkey, and India. Next slide. But on the other hand, the Trump administration, at least in its first try at this, was not very competent about it. In fact, Ben Wittes from Lawfare referred to it as malevolence tempered by incompetence. And this designation of sultanism, which comes from Juan Lintz and Albert Stepan in their examination of the regimes that emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union, is very interesting. And I think that we see a lot of similarities to the approach that was taken in the Trump administration in the first administration, and likely to happen if there's a second. First, the private and the public are fused. So the president's private businesses and everything that's associated with that is fused with the administration and the practice of it. That there's a strong tendency towards familial power and dynastic succession, meaning that the president's offspring are involved in government, that there's no distinction between a state career and personal service to the ruler, a lack of a cohesive socio-political ideology. And here's the way that it really differs from authoritarian governments, because authoritarian governments usually have a pretty clear ideology of what they want, that they're able to communicate. But in this, it's much more ad hoc. Whatever suits the particular ruler, hence the name sultanism, it really is what economic success depends on your personal relationship to the ruler, and the ruler only acts according to his personal with no larger ideological, or as they call it, impersonal goals. Sound familiar? Next slide. So what are the democratic guardrails? We see a reference to this a lot. And sort of in escalating strength, we could say the first one is norms, that this is just the way it's done. It's always the way it's been done. And it's considered to be irregular if it's not done that way. And then there are laws. There's the Constitution. And the final guardrail is really voters who make the ultimate determination of who's going to serve in office. Next slide. So the norms that we've seen in the American system, at least probably in the last half century, is that presidents release their taxes when they're elected. And the rationale for this is that you want to know if the president has conflicts of interest. The president's nominees get a Senate hearing, and we saw this blocked during Obama's administration with Supreme Court nominees, that they're just, and not just Supreme Court nominees, actually a lot of the federal judiciary, and also cabinet officers and undersecretaries, where the Senate simply wouldn't hold hearings to confirm those appointments, which meant a lot of them ended up being vacant. Presidents congratulate the winner when they're defeated and cooperate with the transition. Presidents don't use the military as a prop. Presidents don't publicly demand the investigation of their opponents, and the president's divest of business interests while they're in office. Now, there's no rule for this. I mean, there's no law that makes it necessary to happen. But it generally has been that you would get very bad press if you didn't follow these norms. So presidents generally did so. Next slide. So weaponizing justice. There's an apocryphal quote that's given to several different dictators. I was not able to track down who said it first. But the saying is, for my friends, anything, for my enemies, the law. This slide is out of order, but we'll take it now. Now, this is a direct quote from Trump from a couple weeks ago. People I cheated will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, which includes long-term prison sentences. So that you can see here is a direct promise by the president to use the law for his own means to punish his enemies, and to also use the law to protect himself from opposition. But as we'll see, this requires a compliant judiciary and a compliant Justice Department. Next slide. So what we've seen in the courts over probably, well, at least since the Reagan administration, we've seen that that moderate and liberal justices have been replaced with conservative justices. And Donald Trump has had the opportunity to replace, in terms of the appeals court judges, as many judges in 4 years as Obama was able to appoint in 8 years. And part of this is the delay in confirming judges that were nominated by Obama until a new president was in, and then filling those vacancies on the court with nominees, most of whom were pre-selected by the Conservative Federalist Society. Next slide. So the laws that have restricted executive authority, and there aren't many, but there are some, one of them was the War Powers Act. Now, the War Powers Act was passed in the aftermath of Vietnam, and it held that within 48 hours of deploying troops into a hostile situation, the president has to inform the Congress as to why he's done. Now we have to start saying he and she have done this. And then they have 60 days before they have to come back to Congress and get congressional approval to maintain those troops in that hostile situation. Every president has claimed that the War Powers Act is unconstitutional, but they never tested it in court. And the first president to not follow this was Barack Obama. And when he deployed forces to Libya in 2011, he did not go to Congress within that 60-day period because he knew that the Republican-controlled Congress would not approve the deployment. But this is also a good example of inherent power, because if a president chooses to not follow the War Powers Act in the future, they will claim that Obama set a precedent on it. Trump, in two of the most glaring examples of law-breaking, involves what they call the Hatch Act, something we'll talk about in a little bit. Using the official residence and the office for political means. You're not supposed to campaign from the Oval Office. You're not supposed to hold political rallies on the White House grounds. But in order to challenge that, you have to bring a lawsuit, and the courts have to agree to hear that. Trump has also been charged with incitement, obstruction of justice, retaining classified documents. But those cases are very slowly moving through the courts. The classified documents case has been dismissed by a friendly judge, Eileen Cannon, in the Southern District of Florida, and is now on appeal to the 11th Circuit. Next slide. We've also seen that the court has interpreted the Constitution very, very loosely as a result of having a 6-3 conservative majority. 3 of those people serving on the court were nominated by Donald Trump and confirmed by Republican Congress. The Emoluments Clause holds that you can't profit from foreign or domestic sources. There was a challenge to Trump's use of the Trump Hotel in Washington, D.C., where both foreign dignitaries and domestic supporters stayed at inflated rates, which provided a profit for Trump and his family. The lower court said that, yes, this did violate the Emoluments Clause, but the Supreme Court vacated that decision. The immunity case, as we've seen, provided broad definitions of executive power and said anything that was official act cannot be construed as illegal. And the Colorado 14th Amendment, Section 3, that said if you had supported an insurrection, you were not eligible to run for office unless Congress gave you specific permission to do so. The Supreme Court of Colorado ruled that Trump was ineligible, but the Supreme Court said it was not self-executing. The 13th Amendment, Section 3, was not self-executing. The Congress had to pass a specific law that would spell this out. And next slide. And just to let you know, we will have some time for questions at the end. There is currently a podcast series that's running. It comes from The Atlantic. It's called Autocracy in America, and it's put on by Anne Applebaum and Peter Pomerantsev. And Anne Applebaum is a staff writer at The Atlantic. She has written several books about Eastern Europe and Russia. Her book, Red Famine, about the Ukrainian famine, is called The Holodomor, is really excellent. And she's been writing about the similarities between autocracy in Eastern Europe and in Russia, and warning about what's happening here. Peter Pomerantsev is a Ukrainian immigrant to the United States, a journalist who also spent a lot of time in Russia and observed the backsliding from the transition from the Soviet Union that began to happen once Vladimir Putin took control. There have only been 3. There's supposed to be 5 episodes of this, and they've only had 3. They come out on Fridays. The question marks there are things that I think are probably going to be those episodes, but I'm not sure. But I would really, really recommend it if you just look up Autocracy in America. So the first 3 were attack the truth. So make it so difficult to understand what's true and what's not true, to make it difficult to challenge lies because they're so often repeated, and to just be able to say whatever you want and use it to your advantage without any real connection to the truth. The second step is to capture the courts, and the third is to capture the bureaucracy. Now, I'm expecting that there will be attacks on independent media and also attacks on independent organizations such as unions or nonprofits. This is sort of what we've seen happen, for example, in Hungary. And you'll remember in the debate, Trump cited Viktor Orban of Hungary as being an example of the kind of leader that he admires. They have done all of these things, and in attacking independent organizations, forcing independent universities, independent civic groups to shut down. Next slide. So, attacking the truth. Trump really got his start as a political force in making the claim that Barack Obama was an illegitimate president because he wasn't born in the United States. Now, the birtherism conspiracy theory would have required that Obama's parents would have put an announcement in the Honolulu Advertiser, I think it was 1961 when he was born, announcing his birth so that later on he could run for president even though he wasn't born in Hawaii. But if you look at beliefs about this, Barack Obama was born in the United States. This was done, I believe, in 2010. You can see that the Republicans disagreed that Barack was born. You can see that there's some confusion as to not sure here, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 40% felt that even though they demonstrated the birth certificate and the original newspaper announcement, that this was not the case. Next slide. Okay, Obama's religious beliefs. Obama was a Christian, self-identified as a Christian, but because of his name, there was the conspiracy theory that he was really a Muslim. And you can see here the difference between Democrats and Republicans. Only 10% of Democrats thought he was a Muslim, and what is that, 54? Of the Republicans thought so. So what's true? Well, you'd think that things would get better over time, but they don't necessarily do. Next slide. Oh, I wanted to show you this painting. This is a famous Republican artist by the name of John McNaughton, who paints these allegorical paintings. And in this one, you can see all of the Democratic presidents, plus a couple of Republican ones there. W's in there, Teddy Roosevelt, I think Gerald Ford's hanging out in the back there, with Obama standing on top of a written constitution with the founding fathers in despair. It's called The Forgotten Man. Next slide. And this was one of my favorite posters from the Obama administration, that he was a Muslim, a communist, a Nazi, and Antifa. Next slide. So the 2020 election. Who do you think the true president is right now? All Americans, 75%. Democrats, 97%. Independents, 78%. Republicans, 47%. And when it comes close to your view of the 2020 election, that it was accurate, a majority of Republicans believe that it was inaccurate and that Donald Trump should still be the president. Next slide. And the interesting thing about this, when we look at this, is that more people believe this now than believed it in January of 2021. So if you look, the actions of those who forced their way into the Capitol, there was less than a quarter approved this in January of 2021, and now it's at 30%. And you can see the change with that over time. And this is a good example of if something gets repeated enough and enough elite people echo that fallacy, that you actually see increasing public support for that conspiracy or that essentially that lie. Next slide. This is a recent poll just from last week. The number of Republicans holding that these statements are definitely true. 45% believe that millions of immigrants enter the US each month. This is something that Trump repeats at all of his rallies. For Democrats, that's 9%. In reality, there has never been more than 200,000. And in recent months, it's under 150,000. It's still a huge number of people, but this millions of people coming in every month is just not true. 38% believe inflation is the highest it's ever been. That's also not even close to true. Democrats, that's 14%. 35% believe that crime has fallen everywhere in the world, but in the United States. For Democrats, that's 4%. 23% believe it's legal to kill a baby after birth. That's 9%. And 18% believe that rumors from Springfield, Ohio, that Haitian immigrants are stealing and eating the pets of the white residents. 23 say it's probably true. And with the Democrats, that's 2% and 6% respectively. So why do these people believe this? Because they're hearing it from their political leaders. And it also resonates probably with their pre-existing beliefs that make it likely for them to believe those things. Next slide. Some of the recent, and now the t-shirt, okay, right? But that tweet there on the left comes from the Republicans that are now the chair and of the House Judiciary Committee. Next slide. This is another McNaughton painting. This is a representation of those who are currently in federal prison for their actions on January 6th. And you can see, chained in a cold cell with his Make America Great hat on again. And this is sort of the propaganda that resonates with people who are already supporters and strengthens their perception of whether or not these people should be pardoned and released from jail. Next slide. So controlling the bureaucracy. In theory, and until recently in practice, there is a degree of separation between the office of the president through congressional laws that have created agencies and their oversight. The president has a lot of opportunity to fill the executive branch with people that he would like to put into those places. There's about 5,000 political appointments that the president has the opportunity to make. And about 1,200 of those require Senate confirmation. Next slide. So this is an old slide, but it's one that kind of shows you the difference between all of the employees in one of the executive departments and the number of political appointments that are available. The ones that have a lot, you can see the State Department there. Those are all of the ambassadors that are serving. But generally, it's a pretty limited number, as you can see in the percentage of the employees there. Because if you think of the federal bureaucracy, you're talking about all the people that work for the Forest Service, all the people who work for the post office, all the people who work for the Social Security Administration. And really, the president has the power to appoint the heads of those agencies and their assistants, but generally, and the heads of all of the federal agencies and independent government corporations, but not the rank and file. Next slide. And that's largely the result of what's called the Pendleton Act. The formal name was the Civil Service Reform Act of 1883. Prior to this, presidents appointed their supporters to all of the positions in the federal government. And as I said before, the federal government was pretty limited then because it didn't have that regulatory function, and it didn't have the social safety net function. And it was just, society was a lot less complex. But as the United States industrialized and the federal government's role began to expand with laws that were passed, it required a much, much larger federal workforce. And it was no longer efficient to do this. This is really part of the progressive movement that was active in the latter part of the 1800s that said, you know, we need to have people do their jobs because they're good at it, not because they're a friend or supporter of the president. So it established the civil service. It said you appoint people to jobs based on merit and qualifications, and it limited the number of people that the president could appoint. And that's why you see that it's about 2% of the federal workforce that the president is able to appoint. Next slide. The other one that is important on this is the Hatch Act. And this prevents the president from using the federal workforce as a political force in order to get reelected. And of course, this is something that we see in Democratic backsliding, that there's no distinction between the governing aspects of the whoever's in charge and their attempts to control elections, so that you are able to enlist all of the government employees to further you can imagine having all government employees being ordered to go door to door to hand out literature and talk people into voting for the leader of that party. It says that there needs to be a firewall between government employees and politics. And hiring of civil service can't be based on politics, and federal employees cannot engage in partisan politics. So if you are an employee of the federal government, you are not supposed to, you can participate in the political system, but you can't do it wearing your uniform or driving an official car or with the logo of your agency behind you. Next slide. Now, one of the ways that presidents have gotten around this is called burrowing, and also what they call acting appointments. Burrowing is when you appoint political appointees to a civil service job. You manage to get people that were previously, say, advisors to the president, hired as under the civil service in an agency. And then they can't be removed by the incoming administration. So say you've got an advisor to the Department of Homeland Security that you want in there after you leave office to carry out your agenda. You get them hired to a civil service position. And then when the new administration comes in, you have this person who has this background of influence that now can't be removed from that job. Also acting appointments, firing Senate-confirmed appointees and replacing them with an acting appointee. So you force the Secretary of Homeland Security or the Secretary of Defense to retire, and then you just appoint an acting person to serve that job. And it means that they can serve in that job for 210 days without being presented to the Senate for confirmation. And if you're towards the end of your term, this is one of the ways that you can shape what's happening in your administration. And this was done in spades at the end of the Trump administration. Next slide. This slide shows you the change in both cabinet secretaries, heads of major agencies, and their assistants in various administrations. And there was huge turnover in the Trump administration. And usually it happened because that particular cabinet secretary or assistant or head of an agency failed to comply with what the president wanted to happen. And very often they were replaced with acting people. And generally were ones that were willing to try to carry this out. Now, Trump attempted this with the Justice Department at the end of his term, after he'd lost the election. He had, forced out Bill Barr and put a compliant person in as acting attorney general. And his plan was to fire nearly all of the head people in the Justice Department and replace them with compliant people who would agree to challenge the election. It didn't work because the Justice Department leadership said, we will go public with this. It will be a disaster for you. And he backed off. Next slide. Now, one of the things that Trump has proposed is to change what they call Schedule F employees. And Schedule F employees are ones that they don't need Senate confirmation, but they do play a policy role. But Schedule F employees are part of the civil service. So they can't be fired unless you can prove the misconduct while they have been on their job. So they have job protection. At the end of his administration, Trump wrote an executive order that would strip those civil service protections from federal employees that were involved in policymaking. And it was estimated that it would affect about 100,000 people working in the federal government. Really, pretty much the policy leadership of the executive branch. This was rescinded by Biden when he took office, but Trump has stated that he plans to reinstate it if he's reelected. Next slide. Here's a quote from Trump. This is a quote from early August. So he's going to reissue the executive order, clean out the corrupt actors in our national security and intelligence apparatus. So this is also outlined in that Heritage Foundation Project 2025. Next slide. Attack the media. Challenge their license. Broadcast media needs to be licensed by the Federal Communications Commission. Trump has stated that he wants to have the FCC directly under his control. So this is with regards to NBC. Next slide. ABC and NPR. They have to be licensed to do it. They ought to take away their license for the way they did that. He's talking about how ABC ran the debate. And NPR, of course, National Public Radio, receives federal funding. No more funding from them. So not $1 for them, so it's strip funding for them. He's also pledged to strip funding from states that don't comply with it. For example, when he gave his speech at his golf course in Southern California, he said he would stop sending any funds for firefighting to California if they don't go along with his policy directives. But what he didn't realize is that most of the funding that comes to California for firefighting is on federal lands, on the national forests. So again, sounded good at the time, but probably would not do what he thought. Next slide. So the final guardrail is voters. They have to get elected to pull this off. And it's a very tight election right now. So I think as voters, need to do whatever they can, not only to see that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz win the Electoral College, but get enough of the popular vote that it makes it very, very difficult for people to claim fraud. It's inevitable that they are going to claim fraud. But it gets harder if there is a wider popular vote gap than we've seen in recent elections. And I know that some of you, I know I have, and I'm sure you have, encountered people who say, I can't vote for Harris and Walz because of the Biden administration's policy on Gaza or their policy on criminal justice or whatever. And sometimes you'll hear people say, I can do that in California because California's electoral votes are going to go to Harris anyway. But as far as I'm concerned, one of these two people is going to be elected president. And we have a really unprecedented situation right now where there are a lot of former Republicans who have come out against Donald Trump. And that's something for them because in many cases, it has meant the end of their political career to do so. And, you know, for example, if you look at former presidents, former vice presidents, former presidential nominees, former vice presidential nominees, the only one who has endorsed Donald Trump is Sarah Palin. The others have either, as in the case of Dick Cheney, endorsed Harris or have remained silent. And there's a lot of push on those people to actually come out and not endorse Trump. So I think it's important, regardless of your policy differences with the Democratic nominee, to say we can deal with those policy differences after we make sure that this person who is unfit to serve in the presidency, who has these authoritarian tendencies, does not have the opportunity to go in, further stack the courts, politicize the bureaucracy, attack independent media, and begin more democratic backsliding than we ever thought was possible. So that's my message. And I think we have about a half an hour for questions. So Jane, do you want to take care of calling on people?
I can do that.
Great.
Okay.
So we can stop screen sharing.
Can I tease you for a minute?
Yes.
Can I tease you for a minute?
Sure.
Remember what the two little girls did on how to pronounce Kamala?
Uh-huh.
You slipped up.
Oh, sorry. Kamala.
Kamala, not Kamala. Kamala. You said Kamala.
Sorry.
I'm
Judy,
sorry. I'm teasing,
you
but
can stop
that
screen
shows
sharing.
you how easy it is to slip into that
Mm-hmm.
when you keep hearing them use Kamala.
Right.
It's kind of fascinating, actually, how easily we are programmed. Unwittingly. Okay, during the late 1960s and early 1970s, the left was responsible for politically motivated violence. The left had no support from either party or anyone in government. Today, the right is responsible for politically motivated violence, and the right has support from the Republican Party and their former and perhaps future president. That's a comment.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. Although I think it's also accurate to note that in many aspects they call it the horseshoe theory of politics, that you have the extreme left and the extreme right can sort of converge sometimes. But at this point, I think it's pretty clear that the threat of political violence is much more pronounced on the right than it was, and as the commenter said, it's endorsed by many elected officials. Other questions?
Oh, go ahead.
Maybe raise your hand.
You have two comments from Elliot. Thank you for this, and the next one, excellent. Thank you. I think thank you from all of us. Anybody have any other questions? Nobody seems to have questions. Okay, I have questions.
Julie has a question.
Actually, I don't have a question, but I just happened coincidentally to watch this amazing documentary, I would call it, called From Russia with Lev.
Oh yeah, that was good.
I just saw last night. It was, I mean, I have to admit, I forget a little bit, but this was about the transition around the Russian-Ukrainian issue. But it's very interestingly put together because his wife, that was to me the most interesting part. She is interviewed throughout of her process of observing what happened to her husband when he sort of fell into these traps, and then was horrified by that. Obviously couldn't talk him out of it, but was worried about even about his life. And then in the end, I'll just give you the punchline because I think it's in the promotional. He's just mortified by how many people he affected and how awful it was for him to follow the lies. So it just is parallel to what you were talking about, Kathy, with misinformation and the damage that can be done.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
think there's some other comments there, Jane.
I'm sorry. Oh yeah.
I think there's some other comments.
Yes. What do you think will happen if and when Trump loses and refuses to accept that?
Well, I think that we will see. I don't know that we will see like an attack on the Capitol, but I think we will see what they call stochastic terrorist activities. That a lot of people have been primed for that. And it's, that transition is going to happen in the Biden administration, and it will be a huge challenge, but I think that they are preparing for it. Now, if Trump wins and you have protests against him coming in, he has made it clear that he will use the Insurrection Act to use the military to suppress those protests.
How many people do you think are actually aware of the dangers of this? I mean, are people, is the information getting out sufficiently? It doesn't seem to be. I mean, a lot of people have become aware of Project 2025. And when they do polls about that or ask people about it, there's a great awareness, but it doesn't seem to impact the 45, 48% of the people who are voting for Trump, polling for Trump.
Well, I think you have to separate out that electorate. You have true believers who are, basically willing to say that it would be better to have illiberal government in the United States, if not outright authoritarianism, because it would mean that the right people would be in power. And I suspect that that's probably maybe a third of the Republican Party now. And then you have a lot of people who know better, but are unwilling to put their careers at risk, those serving in government, who are unwilling to come out publicly, even though privately they're very clear that they hope that Trump loses. But they've seen what happens to people who publicly come out against him. Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, and then there are people that are just pretty clueless, right? And they don't read the newspaper. They probably don't even watch Fox News. I think that's probably the true believers. And they absorb narratives from social media very passively. But they absorb narratives like the economy was much better under Trump. And immigrants are bringing disease and crime into the United States. And so that those things then resonate with their previous beliefs. And they generally don't know, they don't know this stuff. They're not paying attention to it. I mean, Julie, I remember you telling me about someone that you were talking to when you were watching the January 6th hearings, and they said, "What's that?"
Yeah. I talked to a neighbor who I said, he's a bright guy. He researches other things and such. I said, why did you, he's for Trump. He would vote Republican. I said, why? He said, well, the taxes are better. Really? Okay. Did you watch the January 6th hearings? Well, no. Are you aware of the Project 2025? No. So I simply suggest that he consider looking into both those things. I want to stay forest walking with him, but I mean, this is interesting. Bob Doran has a question.
Well, yeah, I wanted to respond to one comment. Well, I remember it. It was a question about would the military go along with this? And I heard an interview with Tom Nichols the other day. Tom Nichols is a conservative former professor at the U.S. Naval War College and now writes for the Atlantic. And he said, if you had the top people in the military willing to go along with this, the rank and file would. Because if you ended up having the military leadership unwilling to challenge the president, and then the others are going to follow orders. So it really kind of depends on what the leadership would do.
One comment just arrived as an Air Force veteran during the Vietnam War. I'm sure the military will definitely go along with an authoritarian leader. Another comment, Trump is the framers' worst nightmare. How can we get rid of him? And another comment, I think what will develop here in the U.S. will be similar to what happened in Northern Ireland, the Troubles, in quotes.
Well, a couple comments on those. I think the only way that we'll get rid of Trump is when he shuffles off this mortal coil. Not that I'm advocating that happen anytime soon, but Trumpism, however, it's moved beyond just one person. And there's kind of a debate as to whether or not he's such a unique demagogue that it would not last beyond him. We haven't seen similar people be quite as successful as him when they've tried to mimic that. But I think that Liz Cheney came out today and said, probably the Republican Party is too far gone to resurrect. We'll probably need a new conservative party.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And have I missed some questions?
Yeah, Bob Doran has a question. Bob, would you unmute, please? Bob? Woohoo, Bob? Okay.
I'm
Am I right in the statistics that I heard?
Am I'm unmuted now?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, you're unmuted.
Go ahead.
Now.
Okay, it's not so much a question as a comment on bringing it down to the local level. We have on the ballot this coming up in Eureka is going to be Measure F, which is promoted by Rob Arkley, a local Republican who's a Trumpian, I'm sure. He and Social Security National Bank are supporting what they call the Housing for All initiative, which is to stop public housing, basically. And they have spent $1.25 million on this measure, as opposed to the other side has almost nothing. So what can we do in the face of money being thrown at an issue, which is not really an issue? You know, their name for their initiative, it's straight out of Orwell. You know, just the same way that Trump calls his social thing, we're truth, where it's all lies.
Yeah. Rename it.
You know, there's no guarantee that throwing money at something is going to actually end up winning. So it may be money well spent.
I see it as a great test for democracy, whether or not that will work or not.
Yeah.
I think people need to write articles for the paper, put it on social media, and point out what's going on and why, and what we need to understand or research or talk to and investigate. Because otherwise, you know, we are very fortunate. We have a lot of public media, newspapers that are a rarity in many communities. So many have shut down. And we have the ability to express ourselves by writing editorials. We have some people like Sherman Shapiro who do this routinely, and just point out what's going on. Ask the paper to investigate something if you're interested in it. There's no reason you can't make a call to the paper and say, would you please look into X and write about it, or write about it yourself, or ask a friend.
The reality is that Lost Coast Outposts had a major article about how bad Proposition was, but it was advertising in the middle of it with yes on F, because he's paying every media is bombarded with information from him that he's bought and paid for.
You know, and that sort of stuff works better at a state and federal level than it does at a local level, because you know, at the local level, the fact that there's such a disparity in the money spent on that initiative actually works against it. We saw this several years ago when Pacific Lumber tried to take out the DA because of his actions against Pacific Lumber. And they, you know, used all kinds of things, and they spent a ton of money on it, and they got their hat handed to them. So I think it's probably, we have the opportunity locally to use word of mouth to do it.
Yeah, we're very interconnected in this community. That's a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
And we have lots of basically free media we can use to take advantage of it. There's a question. I'm concerned about voter suppression. Just watch Vigilantes by Greg Palast on Georgia's plan. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, Georgia, this the state organization that's been coming up with all of these voter suppression or voter delay, actually, is getting pushback from the elected Republicans in Georgia, the Secretary of State, the governor, and I'm not sure that they're going to be able to pull that off. I think they have gotten ahead of their skis a bit on that. They're certainly trying, you know, and in Arizona, they planned to take off 100,000 voters because they said they hadn't proved their citizenship when they registered to vote. And a judge just recently reinstated those voters, saying that that the process that they used was not legitimate. So there is some pushback from that. The SAVE Act that they wanted to attach to the budget bill would have required proof of citizenship in order to register to vote. And you would have had to show either a passport or a birth certificate plus proof of residency. But the birth certificate had to have the same name as your proof of residency. So, you know, your birth certificate and your California driver's license. If you were a married woman, you would have trouble with that, right? And so that did not get attached. They have a temporary budget passed until after the election. And so the SAVE Act did not happen.
Comment, after many years, my son-in-law is now out of the Army and always had to be careful not to let it out. He was Democratic. Do you know the military breakdown of Republicans and Democrats?
I don't know the actual numerical breakdown, but I know that it is heavily weighted towards Republicans.
Another comment, the Republican efforts at voter suppression has been a project by that party for years. The Democratic Party has really done nothing to fight this.
Well, the Democratic Party has tried to fight it, but it has not successfully passed legislation. And you know, the process of registering to vote tends to be handled at the state level. And you know, the courts have done a lot to undermine that with decisions about the Voting Rights Act. Gerrymandering is a problem. Allocation of voting resources in poor communities is a problem. And it's really going to probably take a state-by-state approach to this, although there was the John Lewis Act, which would have provided more federal protections. But until you have a party in control of the Congress, both houses of the Congress, then having the ability to pass legislation, you are not going to be able to pass laws that widen enfranchisement, because traditionally low turnout elections tend to favor Republicans and high turnout elections tend to favor Democrats.
Disheartening that if we get every vote from Humboldt for Kamala, will not have much effect on national election.
Every vote counts. As I said, that popular vote is going to be more important in this election than most, because it's going to confer legitimacy to whoever gets it.
Can Trump even vote? Isn't he a convicted felon?
Well, again, those determinations are made state by state. If he was voting in New York, he would not be able to vote. But Florida, in Florida, because he was not convicted in Florida, he is able.
I have I've heard the following statistic, that Republicans constitute 25% of the electorate, Democrats 23%, and independents the rest. In other words, 51% or so. Is that true?
Well, it depends on how you define an independent.
Well, it's a non-Republican and a non-registered.
But I don't know that they're, you know, I think that, first of all, there's a lot of people who aren't registered, right, who never vote.
Yeah.
And most independents, I mean, it's because we have become discouraged with both of our major parties. People tend to have the, you know, I don't like either party, but they definitely lean towards one. So polling tends to identify Democratic leaners and Republican leaners. You know, if you asked a lot of those independents, who did you vote for in the last 4 elections, you would find that there's a definite focus on one of the 2 parties.
What is your projection as to what's going to happen? Do you have one?
I'm a lot more hopeful than I was earlier. That's about all I can say. There's an interesting phenomenon that's happening in states that have Senate races going on. The presidential polling is very close. The Senate polling is not. So places like Nevada, Minnesota, you have the Senate candidates are running very far ahead of their Republican opponents, but the election for president is very tight. And so, who are those people that are supporting Tammy Baldwin and also supporting Donald Trump? It's hard to figure out. And so even the pollsters themselves are saying, it's kind of like the map is not the territory. The poll is not the election. And I can't make any predictions. And all of us who were burned so badly in the past won't make predictions.
Yeah, exactly. An interesting comment. If, quote, the big lie, quote, is correct and Trump is indeed president now, wouldn't he be ineligible to run this time?
That's true. He would be. This is another norm breaking. He has said that he should get another term because he was treated so badly in his first term.
Yeah. Another comment, there are still a lot of, quote, uncommitted, quote, end quote, voters out there. And a wonderful presentation, by the way, and I think everybody would agree on that. I want to suggest and recommend that Kathy's interest group is really interesting and enjoyable, and very much, it's an hour and a half long once a month. I think it's $50 for the entire 2 semesters or a year, or is it just the semester?
No, it's the year.
It's the year. So, like 8 meetings with this fabulously informed, interesting woman who keeps track of what's going on. I think we only have 8 in the group. Why don't you join us? It's such fun. And she does a presentation on a different issue or related issues in a series every time. And you're missing out, guys, on something. It's very interesting statistically. When we look at OLLI classes and even OLLI brown bag lunches, there tend to be way more women than men. In this particular presentation, we have actually 13 men out of 42. I'm impressed. Thank you guys for coming. We'd love to have more of you on board because we have some very interesting classes, and the interest groups, whether it's book groups or Kathy Lee's presentation, just join up with OLLI. And if you haven't, we do need to get up to 1,000 members this year to try to keep our funding. We have $2 million of funding from the Osher Foundation, and they would like us, we got that additional $1 million because we got way beyond what they thought. We got over 1,000. Well, they want us to keep over 1,000. Before the pandemic, we got up to 1,300. But then the pandemic hit, and we got to lost 40%. So we got into the 600s, 500, 600s. We've gotten over, I think, over 700. I don't know exactly where we are, but we need to get back up there. So you get these presentations. They don't cost you a penny. They're all part, even though they're free to the public, you get at least an invitation. You know what's going on. Please do join OLLI if you have not. And please do join us in the interest group class that she does, because it's fantastic. And
I would just like to close with kind of a statement as to, this may have seemed to be a very biased presentation when you think of it in terms of Republicans and Democrats and electoral government. But this is not a normal situation. The United States has never faced this kind of threat to the structure of government. It's never had someone who is so manifestly unfit having an opportunity to have a second term. And we need two parties in the United States for our government to function well. We need to have a strong conservative party that is able to balance so that we can, approach issues in a way that's going to bring both people who focus on order and tradition and people who want to see change and more equality to sort of hash out what's the best way to proceed with that. That's the way that you end up with good policy. But that's not what we have now. We have a cult to a narcissistic sociopath that wants to run the country and wants to round up and deport 15 million of our fellow citizens and fellow inhabitants of this country, to suppress the media, to rig elections, and we all need to do our part to try to step in a calm and measured way to make that case to people who don't understand the stakes right now. So that's what I'll leave you with.
Okay, and I'll leave you with information on September 30th. We're going to have updates on Alzheimer's with Claire Day from the Alzheimer's Association and Kim Clavo. Every year they have a conference on Alzheimer's where they introduce the latest research, and that's what they'll be presenting. And if you have any concerns about maybe not having about the possibility of Alzheimer's or mental decline, I think you'd find it interesting. They do this. I would have them do it at least once a year. So you're welcome to come again next Monday. Hope to see you there. Thank you so much, Kathy. You're wonderful. We appreciate it. And yes, we do have a point of view, but I think it's not really a partisan issue. It's a national concern. It's nonpartisan. It's like we have to make our choices. I'm an attorney. I went to law school in order to learn how the world worked, and I worked in Washington at the Urban Institute for a number of years and worked with bureaucracy at EPA. And it's our responsibility to basically participate and try to form and maintain our union to the greatest possible extent. So please get out there, round up your neighbors to go vote. Even though it's California, the popular vote matters, and locally it matters. The issues matter. We're going to be having a presentation week after next, I think. No, the one after that, on October 14th, on the pros and cons of statewide ballot measures in November, and they'll also include a number of the local ones. So look forward to seeing you. Happy anxiety times.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Take care, all.
Have a good day, everyone.
You